Welcome to part two of a three-part series of talks that I call Why Liberals and Conservatives Don't Understand Each Other. My name is Kenneth Ng. I'm going to repeat some caveats that I gave in part one. If you haven't seen part one, I recommend that you start with that because we're going to build on the concepts that we talked about in part one. But in this series, I'm going to be talking pretty frankly about what each side of our political divide believes. It's not going to be my intention to take a centrist position and try to offer a middle ground. Instead, what I'm going to be doing is sometimes channeling what conservatives believe, or at least my take on what conservatives believe, and at other times channeling what liberals believe. In this part two, we're going to be talking about some very specific political issues. A few of these are going to be a little controversial, like when we talk about affirmative action. So I just want to forewarn you about that. At times there might be things that I'm channeling from each side that make you a little comfortable depending on what your political orientation is. My other caveat is that as I describe the opinions of a prototypical conservative and a prototypical liberal, I'm going to be making some pretty gross generalizations. I think most people have more nuanced opinions than the ones I'm going to describe. In fact, I doubt that anybody that listens to this series is going to think that I'm accurately describing them, but I'm going to try to find the center of gravity of the two ideologies in the United States and describe those, and so that we can sort of understand where each side is coming from. The point here is not agreement, it's just understanding. I want to give a quick preview of what we're going to talk about here in part two. We're going to first be applying the two secular moral systems that was talked about in part one, coming from the book Moral Politics, and we're going to apply those to contemporary issues. And then we're going to refer to the book called The Politics of Resentment and listen to how rural voters make sense of politics. Then, as sort of a teaser for part three, we're going to be talking about why politics in the United States has become so toxic in that next part, and then finish up with discussing how we might be able to have constructive conversations about politics. And we're going to be referring to some ideas that come out of the book, The Political Brain. So let's get started. Actually, the first thing I want to do is a very quick review of some things we talked about in part one, just to refresh our memories, because we're going to be building on this. Remember, we talked about three books: Prius versus Pickup, The Righteous Mind, and Moral Politics. We were building a foundation for understanding the different political opinions in the United States. We got the conservative and we got the liberal. It starts with a worldview. For the conservatives, thought the phrase that summed up the worldview of conservatives the best was the phrase, the survival of the fittest. On the liberal side, the phrase I thought fit was, we are our brother's keeper. And then there's also a fundamental assumption about human nature. For conservatives, it seemed to be kind of pessimistic, that people by nature are selfish, hedonistic, egotistical, and that people respond to reward and punishment. That's where their motivations come from. On the liberal side, it's a little more optimistic about human nature. They think that people by nature just want to be valued and cared for, and that people, they seek approval and they seek belonging. That's what motivates them. With those two fundamental assumptions about the nature of the world and the nature about human beings, then you start building these moral models. And the first thing that we talked about came from Prius versus Pickup. This is that fixed versus fluid worldview, and it leads to some instinctive preferences. For the conservative or the fixed, they like predictability, they like what works, The tried and true is attractive to them, and they like black and white solutions. They like certainty. Over on the liberal worldview, it was more fluid. These kind of people instinctively like novelty and variety. They think you keep improving yourself, keep improving society, and they see nuance in a lot of things. So these are kind of two different instinctive worldviews and preferences. Then we talked about what I call adaptive goals or reasoned goals that came from moral politics. Over on the conservative side, which was that strict father morality model, that the top three goals over there, number one was self-discipline, number two, self-sufficiency, and number three was a respect for authority. Over on the liberal worldview, which this was the nurturant parent morality model that came from moral politics, those adaptive goals were number one, to develop empathy, number two, develop a capacity for nurturance, and number three, maintaining social ties. Then we also have the input from the righteous mind. I call these intuitive values. On the conservative side, there's 6 categories of values, and the main point was conservatives value almost all of the, pretty much equally, all 6 of these values when they're judging good and bad, right and wrong. Whereas for liberals, there tend to be 2 that are a lot higher than the others. Those are protection against oppression and then care versus harm. And the other 4 categories of values have less importance over in the liberal worldview. So we prioritize things, we value things differently. So that's sort of the summary that leads us into today. So where I want to go next in this discussion is talk about how those cultural value systems, their intention is to guide the development of people and communities, and understanding how the elements of those cultural values influence politics, I think is kind of like peeling an onion, where you uncover deeper and deeper fundamentals. In business, we had a technique that we called the 5 whys, and this was used to get to the root cause of things. You keep asking why. I'm going to do something kind of similar, except I'm going to go in the reverse direction. I'm going to start with the root causes, the fundamental causes, and then call it the 4 therefores. Based on that, therefore you do this, and therefore you do that. So let's sort of step through this. So here is my 4 therefores, where you start with what the secular moral systems start with, those 2 basic assumptions. What is the basic nature of the world, and what is the basic nature of human being? And then you start building a society. So then you, based on those assumptions, you conclude that human beings need to have certain kind of character traits, and they'll be different based on what those assumptions were. Once you sort of decided what character traits people need to have, then you can conclude what kind of child rearing practices families should follow to create those character traits. And then you start thinking about what the community values should be, what the norms should be, how they get established, how they get enforced to reinforce the family, to create those kinds of people. And then you back up all the way to the government. You make some decisions about what ways government support, control, and incentives can be used to support the communities, that support the families, that support the individuals. And the whole point here is that they all fit together. They're like interlocking pieces of a puzzle. And that if any of these are not really aligned or aren't following the same philosophy, then the effectiveness of the whole system starts to decay. And this is why there's political concerns that are being expressed that affect every layer of this, because rightfully, for a coherent system, you sort of need to have all of these different layers of society really lined up well. Now we're sort of oriented to prepare to start to talk about specific social issues. And the first one that I want to talk about here is welfare programs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of channel what conservatives believe, and then I'm going to channel what liberals believe. So let's start with conservatives. My assessment is that conservatives are generally against government welfare for adults because they believe that government handouts create dependency. They believe that incentives to work will motivate people to improve themselves and to find a job, and that jobs are really important to the conservative point of view. They're central to the personal, familial, and community well-being. So they believe that all the incentives should lead men and women, but especially men, toward being in the paid workforce, because this is the way that society is best served and is healthiest, is when everybody is working. There is some support in the conservative side for children, uh, support through the government for children, so that's acceptable because it doesn't erode these motivations to participate in the workforce. So conservatives absolutely believe that the American dream is still alive and thriving, whereby anyone can be successful via hard work. So let's look at what their opinions about welfare programs are. Liberals are generally supportive of government welfare programs because they believe that we should be taking care of people who need help. And we should be investing in people to help them improve, because life is not always fair and jobs are not always available, so government should level things out. And families in need with children should get enough support that the children will not be experiencing severe stress due to poverty. So they believe in enough support from the government to support the children and the parents, and don't worry so much about the motivations for the parents. The key here is the children, and that if you punish the parents for not being in the workforce, then the children are going to be suffering themselves and they're just not going to thrive. So it all goes together. And this is because liberals believe that there are historical and structural social reasons that hard work is not all that is needed. So what do the different sides think about illegal immigration? Well, conservatives see illegal immigrants as lawbreakers, and thus they should be punished. Since illegal immigrants are not citizens, they're thus not part of us, and to be expected to provide food and housing and health care for illegal immigrants is like being expected to feed and house and care for children in our neighborhood who just come into our house uninvited. They were not invited, they have no business being here, and we have no responsibility to take care of them. That's my summary of how the strict father morality conservatives think about illegal immigration. On the other hand, nurturant parent liberals, they see illegal immigrants as just people that are desperate to find a better life. And furthermore, from a practical standpoint, these people work at jobs that nobody wants for low wages, so there's definitely a role for them, there's a place for them. And frankly, we should be seeing these people as citizens in the making and support them and absorb them. Very different views about immigration that kind of tie back. You can see how these tie back to those fundamental moral goals for the conservatives, where authority and boundaries and following the rules is really important. But on the nurturant parent, that empathy and nurturance and fairness and having the strength to care for people that aren't like you are values for them. So it's definitely, I think, comes from value systems. So let's look at taxation. Conservatives believe that the rich are model citizens who, through self-discipline and hard work, have achieved the American dream. They have earned what they have and they deserve to keep it. When the rich are taxed more than others for making a lot more money, they are being punished for being model citizens. This is a violation of the morality of reward and punishment. By forcibly taking their money from them against their will, it's seen as unfair and immoral, sort of a form of theft. Furthermore, high taxes reduce the incentive for striving for success and taking risks in business and risks in one's personal life. And if people stop taking risks to innovate, our economy is going to stagnate. So this is counterproductive from their point of view. Liberals, on the other hand, think that those that have should help those that do not have. And part of the reason is because nobody is successful in a vacuum. The rich are benefiting from the kind of society that we all are cultivating and making collectively. And that society as a whole will be healthier if we can make that wage gap smaller. So furthermore, the rich can afford the higher taxes and they reject the idea that they're just going to pick up their toys and go home. They don't think that higher taxes is going to make them stop trying to achieve. So they think that's a red herring. So let's look at different opinions, the different sides' opinions about the military. For conservatives, supporting the military as an institution is really like supporting the culture of strict father morality. The military is hierarchical. It's promoting obedience to a legitimate authority. It cultivates self-discipline. It has strict moral boundaries. It builds strength, and it fights evil. This makes the military pretty much sacrosanct to conservatives, even beyond that protective function that it has. Support for military engagements is also a reflection of patriotism, and thus is automatically a function of the loyalty value. And then there's actually a bonus for conservatives, which is that lots of people who go through the military often adopt the strict father values. So that's helpful too. On the liberal point of view, they just fundamentally think we spend more on the military than we need to, and that we should rebalance our priorities, and we should give more priority to helping America's needy. And that's pretty straightforward. They're not saying no military, but they're saying, hey, we're way overdoing it here, and we've got better things to do with our money. So that's a very practical point of view, and it's partly from that notion that loyalty and patriotism don't have as high a priority over on the liberal side. It's just not a black and white thing for them. So let's sort of take a pause here. We've talked about the rationale for differing policy positions on welfare, on illegal immigration, on taxation, and the military. And I want to make sort of a more general point, which is already, I think you can see that each side probably sees the other as immoral, if not that, at least kind of lunk-headed, because neither side wants to recognize that there are two opposed, highly structured, well-grounded, widely accepted, but utterly contradictory moral systems at the center of American politics. And this is a failure to see that politics is fundamentally about secular morality. And that makes all politicians look immoral from one side or the other, and it hides a deep logic between the political positions. Let's talk about crime. For conservatives, it's pretty simple. Violent crime calls for strict punishment. It's also assumed that punishment will work to eliminate violence. If you look a little deeper, conservatives believe that violent crime has been the result of permissive child raising practices, reflecting a lack of strict discipline at home. And if you extrapolate that a little further, they believe that a mother's nurturance without the father's discipline produces antisocial, uninhibited, maybe even violent children with no respect for the law, because they didn't have the father's authority present to give them appreciation of respect for the law. So basically, the conclusion of this reasoning is that you can attribute the rise in violent crime to the corresponding decline in the presence of fathers in American homes due to divorce or illegitimacy. It's pretty harsh, but that's, I think, kind of what their worldview is. Over on the nurturant parent morality, crime, in their point of view, is often the result of insufficiently nurturant families and insufficiently nurturant societies. Crime is also the result of desperation and despair due to societal failures. And frankly, liberals dismiss this characterization of nurturant child raising as excessively permissive. Discipline is maintained through loving, respectful, and firm interactions and a constant attention to mutual responsibilities and explanations. It's just to label this as, the wild, wild west, excessively permissive, is just deliberately mischaracterizing how, the goals and how it's done in the nurturant parent paradigm. So let's look at gun control, an area of a fair amount of contention between the two sides. I believe that conservatives believe that those in position of authority also carry the responsibility of providing protection, and guns are seen as an individual's form of protection in a hostile world and are appropriate given the male's role as the family protector. Furthermore, conservatives also fear what you call the slippery slope, where laws that start out just outlawing things on the margin then get expanded to restrict more common uses of guns, and that ultimately they feel like liberals want to take away their guns, that that's their ultimate goal. Also, I think factoring strongly in the conservative position is the cultural significance of gun ownership and recreational use. Guns are part of group identity and they provide opportunities for group interaction and cohesion, so they have a sort of a binding role over there in the conservative point of view. For liberals, well, it's pretty cut and dried. Guns enable and escalate violence. Guns are unnecessary. And frankly, the gun laws that are being proposed are reasonable and they're necessary considering some of the mass shootings that we've had. So they just don't see eye to eye with conservatives on gun control. Let's look at prisons and criminal justice system. So conservatives, I believe, think that sometimes liberals are showing more empathy for the criminals than they are for the victims of the crime. In their vision of fairness, retribution via punishment defines justice, and that people will commit crimes if it's in their self-interest, i.e., if the punishment is too lenient, and they will be deterred if the punishment is harsh. Following the rules and respecting authority are very important in that worldview, and they're important for maintaining a healthy society. Furthermore, they feel that, I've mentioned this in the last lecture, part 1, that they feel that the essence of a person is really established by adulthood, and that past behavior is a guide to essential character, and essential character predicts future behavior. Therefore, a repeat offender has a bad character, and he or she is likely to commit crimes again. So, to protect the public, that person should be imprisoned, probably for a considerable amount of time, sort of on the better safe than sorry, and assuming that criminals are going to, change their colors is a bad bet. So over on the liberal side, they believe that crime has social causes, for instance, poverty, unemployment, alienation, or a lack of a caring community. And furthermore, they believe that law enforcement and the courts and prisons have just scooped up a disproportionate number of minorities, plus prison terms are too long for many kinds of crimes, and that rehabilitation and reintegration should be the goal. That too many people are locked up for too long, and that we need to be focusing more on getting them back on the right track with rehabilitation and reintegration. That should be our priority. Whole different view about criminal justice between the two. Let's look at social justice, a slightly different topic here. Conservatives, well, in their worldview, class hierarchy is simply a ladder that's there to be climbed by anyone with the talent and the self-discipline to climb it. Whether or not you climb the ladder of wealth and privilege is only a matter of whether you have the moral strength and the character and the inherent talent to do so. Explanations in terms of social forces or class make no sense. They're only seen as excuses for a lack of talent or laziness or some other form of moral weakness. In that worldview, the concept of social justice just doesn't make sense. Over on the liberal side, they firmly believe that there are unfair institutional and social and economic barriers that are keeping people from advancing, and that America should be helping people who are struggling because lots of times it's not entirely their fault, and that government should help level the playing field. So this is a whole different view of the nature of people, and frankly, a different view about what the kinds of opportunities in the United States are and what it takes to be successful. Let's look at economic justice, a little bit different angle on this. For the conservative point of view, this is, economics, jobs, that the market should be deciding how much a worker or even a producer should be compensated. It's up to the worker to develop the skills and the attitude that is valued, and that minimum wages distort this feedback, and they ultimately result in fewer jobs or in failing businesses. For one reason, U.S. businesses have to compete with the entire world, so labor costs need to be competitive on an international basis, at least enough to not put U.S. businesses at such a disadvantage that they can't be competitive. So this is pretty Darwinian, the way they look at economic justice. Over on the nurturant parent morality, the liberals, first of all, they believe that if business is not regulated, then owners will exploit workers as much as they can get away with. Furthermore, globalization and automation has just really widened the wealth gap, and that this large wealth gap is not healthy for our society. And frankly, the large wealth gaps are unfair. The winners in this are being rewarded excessively, and that's just not unfair. That is unfair. So they see minimum wages and capital gains taxes and progressive tax rates as a way of evening out the benefits from our national prosperity. Far too much of the rewards of our prosperity are going to far too few people, just because of the way globalization and automation has changed the dynamic. So, what do the two sides think about government regulation? Well, conservatives believe that government regulation falls in the category of interference with the pursuit of self-interest by people trying to make a living. These are the good people in our society, and they're demonstrating the qualities necessary to be successful. We want to encourage people like them, and it's wrong to put up roadblocks in their way. Furthermore, they see regulators as being stupid and corrupt and enforcing regulations that are unnecessary and cumbersome and get in the way of doing business. So they're quite skeptical about government regulation. On the liberal side, they see government having a role that their job is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And this can be individual citizens, this can be workers, this can be protecting honest businessmen from unscrupulous businessmen, making sure that the rules are fair. This is also protecting the environment, because it can't protect itself. Furthermore, the bottom line is liberals realize that businesses are amoral. They have no formal responsibility to do the right thing. They only have one responsibility, and that is to produce as much profit as they can and basically to stay in business. So this is kind of ironic because you think about it, conservatives trust businessmen, but they don't trust people. Whereas liberals trust people, but they don't trust businessmen. This is kind of ironic. I say that history has proven that trusting businessmen is not wise. Nonetheless, many regulations really are excessive, and we need to acknowledge that. So let's take another pause to reflect on some of the things we've talked about. So in this portion, we talked about crime, we talked about gun control, then prisons, social justice, economic justice, and government regulation. Now, it's another sort of meta thing I want to comment about is that one difference that we haven't commented too much about is that liberals evaluate many issues on a cost-benefit basis. If a program pays for itself, or if more people can be successful for a modest investment, or if the playing field can be leveled without our economy collapsing, then liberals believe that they have a strong case. However, conservatives see most of these issues in moral terms, in absolute moral terms, with no gray area in many cases. So a cost-benefit analysis based on money or statistics, that's just not persuasive to conservatives. Now, on our next 4 topics, we're going to look at 4 pretty divisive issues, which are usually shrouded in a cloak of political correctness that make discussions awkward. But we're not going to shy away from that. So away we go. Start with affirmative action. So on the conservative point of view, giving people things they have not earned removes those incentives to be self-disciplined, etc. By giving some people preferential treatment, affirmative action is unfair. You should have to earn what you get, and people don't need preferential treatment. Anyone can succeed if they develop the right skills and the right attitudes and they work hard. I think this characterizes the conservative view about affirmative action. The liberals, they think that government should ensure that its citizens treat each other fairly. And because of stereotyping and discrimination, those are unfair to many groups of people. And that groups that are not stereotyped and not discriminated against have an advantage. So affirmative action just rebalances the scale to overcome that advantage that the majority benefits from. It seems very logical and necessary to liberals. Let's talk about multiculturalism. From the conservative point of view, they believe that American culture was built on the strict father morality values. I actually think they're right about that. It was sort of America, particularly in the early days, it was a self-selected society. The people that came to America were the people that wanted to be independent, that wanted to be left alone, and that were expecting to have to work hard and make their way. They were very much on board with this survival of the fittest mentality. That's part of what attracted them to America. So we did start out, I think, with a big, um, you know, a large amount of people that subscribed to what is now the conservative point of view. Conservatives think that they are in a constant battle to keep that strict father morality dominant in the United States. And if other cultures do not put a high priority on the strict father morality values like self-discipline and self-control and self-reliance, that will have a corrosive effect on the strict father morality culture. As we pointed out again and again in part one, there's this strong belief that there's one right way of doing things. It's the time-tested way, and that you need to follow that pattern, and that other ways are just diverting you from the right way. So this is why they're on guard for multiculturalism, because you're going to come in and you're going to propose a whole different value system, a whole different way of developing people, and that isn't the right way. And so we need to insist that we stay on the right track here. I think that kind of sums up what they think. So, as I sort of implied there, conservatives feel that they have an obligation to defend their moral system. Frankly, historically, America has had more success with assimilation into the American culture, so everyone ended up pursuing the same goals with the same consistent rules. Now, I realize that most of these went through this cycle where originally an out group was discriminated against, and then eventually, as the two cultures got used to each other and integrated a little bit more, then ultimately the assimilation happened. There was this sequence. It wasn't instant. But the point is that was the ultimate end, is that most of the cultures that were implanted into the United States ultimately assimilated into the American culture. That's the history of it. Now, the liberal policy on multiculturalism, all people are valuable, all people deserve our respect, and the differences should be respected. And that, frankly, diversity makes our country better. Liberals now feel that differences should not just be tolerated, but they should be accommodated. So this is a whole different way of thinking about the value of diversity that is a cause of a lot of friction in the United States right now, I believe. So let's get to another controversial topic, which is LGBT rights. From the conservative point of view, for some conservatives, I believe that homosexuality actually evokes feelings of disgust, and that violates the sanctity value that we talked about when we talked about the moral foundation theory in the righteous mind, that there's this feeling of sanctity that this violates for them, and that they feel that this is just an unnatural and sacrilegious use of the body, And some conservatives see being gay as simply a conscious choice of a particular way of life, and thus it's just a matter of self-control and self-discipline, i.e., moral strength, and that sanctioning this gay lifestyle can also lead other people astray. And so this is a violation of the moral boundaries, moral goals, and also defending the strict father morality, which is sort of there's one way and only one way that's time tested, and that's the one we need to follow. For these reasons, some conservatives just have a hard time accepting the idea that homosexuality is biologically determined, natural, and normal. And furthermore, for conservatives, gay marriage is just the wrong model for the family. Strict father morality expressed in a family has a single source of authority, and that is the father. And so gay marriage just messes with that paradigm for them. I realize that this is pretty distressing for people that, well, for gay people, but also people that are supportive of gay rights. But I think that this probably describes where some of the conservatives are coming from, and that just understanding where they're coming from can be helpful as we try to have dialogue about this. To leave it a complete mystery is, I don't think, helpful about, so why are they against this? Over on the liberal side, for liberals, gay rights and all rights concerning sexual orientation are just self-evident, just like a nurturant parent treats all of his or her children fairly and loves them equally, whether gay or not. So should society, so should government. Any and all laws, rules, and norms should apply equally to all citizens, regardless of sexual orientation. This is no different than rights protecting gender and race and nationality, ethnic origin, religion, etc. And I think most liberals acknowledge that sexual preferences is biologically determined and it's natural. But you know what? That's not what the debate should be about. This is about every human being having a right to live their life as they see fit, as long as they are meeting their societal obligations and not hurting anyone. So it's kind of easy to get a little ramped up about this because it's very, very different points of view that cause a lot of conflict. So we're going to go into another controversial topic here. This is the fourth and the last one, abortion. And on this topic, I want to state up front that my assessment of the status of the dual ideologies regarding abortion are pretty blunt and liable to raise people's hackles. And I can't say that this assessment was extracted fully formed from any of the books that we're referencing in this lecture, but I think that my assessment here is plausible because they reflect the differing principles of the two morality systems that we're looking at. Now, I'm going to first acknowledge that many pro-life conservatives base their stance on the sanctity of human life, and they consider abortion to be baby killing and equivalent to murder. I acknowledge that, but I'm going to postulate that there's usually more to it than that, and I'm going to postulate that for both sides, abortion is a complicated moral issue and a secular moral issue. And this postulation goes something like this, that for conservatives, they believe that an unmarried teenage girl should not be having sex at all. That is a moral weakness. It's a lack of self-discipline. It's a form of immoral behavior. An abortion would just simply sanction and enable this kind of immoral behavior. She would be getting away with it. A different, smaller subset of conservatives might be referencing that natural order that we talked about in their worldview, where there's a natural order of things that say that when a woman chooses an abortion in order to place her career above motherhood, that she's being selfish and she's turning away from her role in the natural order, because a family is literally the foundation of the strict father morality. So they think this is, wrong priorities. Further, by asserting that life begins at conception, then the strict father morality focus on authority figures providing protection aligns pretty nicely with this notion of protecting a helpless, innocent child in the womb. So that aligns pretty well, makes kind of sense given the values of that worldview. For liberals on abortion, they believe that if a teenage girl is in trouble, she should be helped and she deserves empathy. The last thing she needs is someone bawling her out, telling her how bad she is. Furthermore, teenage girls are usually not ready to be a mother. She has her whole life ahead of her and shouldn't have her aspirations thwarted due to an unintentional pregnancy. She has plenty of time to have children and be a mother later when she can raise them properly. So it just makes practical sense. Furthermore, in this belief system, an embryo is not a person until the pregnancy is pretty far along. So she should have an abortion if she decides that is the best option for her, and there's nothing immoral about it. Furthermore, if the option to have an abortion is not legally available, then women are going to have to resort to back alley abortions again, which are really risky for women. And that's a very salient point. So I think this describes two sides of the argument. I may have it wrong, but I think that's what is sort of behind it from a secular morality point of view. So we just made it through 4 kind of emotionally charged ones: affirmative action, multiculturalism, LGBT rights, and abortion. I want to touch on, it's a good time to mention another challenge for achieving constructive dialogue between people that are subscribing to different belief systems. And that is that it's pretty natural for people to withhold their private opinions about topics that are controversial. There's a lot of reasons people will do this. It's kind of like social peer pressure. But I don't really need to get into all the reasons that people will misrepresent what their point of view is. But the stronger the community pressure to hold a conforming opinion is, then the more likely it is that what is apparent group consensus might actually be weaker than you think it is. So that's just the point I want to make there. It applies to those 4 topics that we just talked about. So I think we're past the hardest stuff. The next topics are extremely important, but they're not as emotionally charged. So onward. Let's talk about education. Conservatives believe that the strict parent morality is the right morality and the only acceptable morality. And they believe that all of the major ills in our present society come from a failure to abide by that morality. And they see these beliefs being challenged in courses taught in university, which is considered to be a moral outrage. Even teaching a more balanced view of America or Western history undermines the strict parent morality, if for no other reasons than it's undermining the role modeling of the American heroes and the ethos that was in play with the establishment of America as an independent country. So this is a source of great agitation that colleges are teaching this more balanced, nuanced version of history. For liberals, they say that similar to the civil rights movement, these recent advances in feminism and gay rights and environmentalism and multiculturalism, these are moral advances in American culture and civilization, and they should be taught as positive advances in the higher education curriculums. This means teaching a balanced view of history, including past abuses sanctioned and abetted by major forces in American society and the government itself. This is not seen as putting down America. On the contrary, this is the glory of America. Very different approach to education about history and those kinds of things. So let's reflect on policy difference about education in a broader view, because I think education policy is a place where the 2 ideologies really come into conflict. Because which ideology gets the preference when you're setting up an educational curriculum? What values are given attention? You know, higher education has tilted more and more left ever since the 1960s, which conservatives see as an attack on their value system. And furthermore, the majority of people that become educators are nurturers by nature, while it's certainly not for the money. And I think these are some of the reasons why homeschooling and private schools are promoted by conservatives, so they have control over the value system that's taught. And just as important, shield their children from being led astray by exposure to these erroneous alternative value systems. So it makes sense in their worldviews that there's only one tried and true way, that having homeschooling or private schools, they can get that aligned. So let's dive a little deeper into school orientation. For conservatives, the way they see how classroom instruction should go is that you should be emphasizing self-discipline. You should be emphasizing the Western European heritage. You should be making students work hard, using a system of rewards and punishments to motivate them. You grade seriously and rigorously, and you do fail people who deserve to fail, and the awards accrue for achievement. That's their vision of schools, because after all, life is survival of the fittest. For liberals, you know, let's start out by admitting that, of course, emphasizing self-discipline and hard work is important. They don't deny that. But also learning to cooperate and work with others is important. It's important to develop social skills. They think it's very valuable to foster creativity. You should expose students to the complexity of the world and expose students to the variety in the world. And furthermore, student failure is as much our failure as their failure. This is how they see things. So let's reflect on what the ramifications are of these differing opinions about school curriculum. What should be the orientation of an education experience? Should it be competition or should it be cooperation? Should the focus be on rote learning or learning through questioning? Do you motivate via grades or do you motivate via engaging the students? Do you let the laggards fail or do you double down on your efforts to engage those that are falling behind? Do you teach an idealized and aspirational version of the world or do you teach critical thinking? And more fundamentally, do you teach the narrow curriculum of strict father morality, or do you teach a broad curriculum of nurturant parent morality? Now, what you should notice is that there's an inherent catch-22 here, because if one side believes in tolerating multiple points of view and prioritizes the nurturance approach, but the other side believes there's only one right way of doing things and it doesn't center on nurturance, well, you can't have it both ways. So this is a fundamental conundrum for education. Let's go to the topic of charity. Absolutely, conservatives volunteer a lot. They donate a lot. But conservatives also believe that the personal connection is important, because if the giver has a relationship with the receiver and if the receiver has a relationship with the giver, both benefit in multiple ways. This enhances community ties and it imposes some motivation on the receiver to make good use of the gift. They see as outsourcing our charity to the government as missing all of those extra benefits. So that's not their chosen mechanism for charity. Liberals also volunteer a lot and they donate a lot. But liberals are less concerned with the deservingness of the recipients than conservatives are. And furthermore, if you're able to hand pick who the recipients of the aid is going to be, then we would be leaving, out groups underserved. If you're a group that hasn't really, engendered the attention and sympathy of the people that are doing the donating, then you're just going to be left out, and that's just not fair. So they see outsourcing charity to the government as just a more efficient way of doing that. And this makes sense in an urban setting, especially because it's pretty unworkable to think that in a big city that each giver is going to have a relationship with the recipients and vice versa. That just is unworkable. Furthermore, aid needs to counterbalance the economic cycle. If charity is private, then when things get a little dicey economically and people are struggling economically, then they're going to be less inclined to be generous in their charity. Well, that's exactly the time that you need more charity because there's more need out there, more suffering going on. So they work in opposition to each other. what you really need is you need the government to be involved, because the government can step up when the economy is in a down cycle. And especially when you think about when entire communities are struggling economically, who's there to provide this charity? That's just not workable. So again, the government is a more effective and efficient way to deliver that. Different views about charity. So let's talk about the environment. For conservatives, there's that natural order thing. Man has dominance over nature. So for conservatives, nature is a resource, and it's there to be used by man for his self-interest and his profit due to the natural order of dominance. Now, frugality is also a virtue, so the resource should be conserved by not being too wasteful. That's their approach. Just use what you need, but it is there for your use to support man. So the value of nature and resources is not really intrinsic, but rather determined by how useful it is to human beings and how plentiful it is. It's a pretty utilitarian view of the environment. For liberals, the natural world is what gives us life, and it makes all of life possible, and it's what sustains us. Our relationship with nature is as the recipient of nurture from nature, and as such, it involves attachment to nature. Nature has inherent value. We should be feeling gratitude about nature. We should feel some responsibility toward nature, respect nature. There's an independent relationship between us and nature, and it's just a source of love and adoration, and there should be a continuing commitment to this interdependence. Yeah, kind of a, tree hugger motto there, I would say. Well, that was disrespectful there, but anyway, that's pretty nature loving. So liberals, they assign an intrinsic value to aspects of nature that the market just does not and cannot. Market solutions may help in some cases, but they just can't address the deepest of the liberals' concerned. So market solutions are not the be-all and end-all for righting our relationship to nature. So let's talk about extremism. Here's an interesting topic. So from the conservative point of view, responsibility lies with the individual to live up to the standard of self-discipline and self-control. If they go too far, causing violence or harm, then it's the individual that's at fault. Extreme behavior in support of the moral system is not seen as being the fault of the moral system. It's the fault of the individual that went out of bounds. Liberals think that conservatives should own up to the results of their ideology being misused in violent and harmful ways. If you light the fire, don't be surprised if it rages out of control. Furthermore, this absolutist black and white nature of the conservative morality model is part of the problem, because there's no priority given to tolerance or empathy, and so violence is inevitable, and the promoters of the ideology should be held responsible. That's, I think, pretty firmly stated there. So those are kind of two different ways of thinking about extremism. Okay, let's take another pause, think about what we just talked about. We talked about education and school orientation. We talked about charity, the environment, and extremism. Next, we're going to try to round out the survey of political philosophies of the Republicans and the Democrats by talking about more general topics. Um, these aren't topics that necessarily align with the value system that have secular morals behind them, but nonetheless they're very important. So for instance, opinions about jobs in the economy don't align with a worldview necessarily, but the importance of jobs can't be overstated. It's not in dispute. Jobs are probably the most important piece to living a fulfilling and successful life. And not being able to get a job is both financially and psychologically debilitating. But we need to admit, society can't merely will a job into existence. In fact, I would postulate that competing worldviews about the economy used to be what separated Republicans and Democrats from World War II up into the 1990s, before the political parties shifted to trying to appeal directly to moral worldviews instead of economic or class interests. Nonetheless, jobs are often the strongest political motivator and probably the most fluid differentiator, because I don't think either side really has a lock on this policy issue. There's dueling worldviews about what leads to success in the economy and thus in the competition for jobs. For the Republicans, I'm going to describe a free market capitalism philosophy where free market capitalists believe that the key to economic prosperity lies in the ownership class because they create the jobs. Anything that makes it harder for a business to compete in the international market is improper. And furthermore, they believe in that invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about for markets to self-regulate and self-guide the economy to maximum efficiency. That's a cornerstone of the free market capitalism ideology. And prices should be what the market will bear, and wages should be dictated by what the market values. Both the employer and the employee are worthy of their rewards, and these are self-evident testaments of good character. To be successful in business means that you are doing what you're supposed to do, and you became the kind of person that you're supposed to be. And that anything that mutes the rewards for this are improper and just contrary to society's interests. And that's the worldview over there. For Democrats, well, they think way back to the Second Industrial Revolution, 1870 to 1905, where the world recognized that the power of the ownership class was completely overwhelming the power of the worker class. Business was leveraging that power to exploit workers, and thus this was not in the best interest of society as a whole. So government stepped in to regulate business to push back on those abuses. Since then, it's accepted wisdom that completely unfettered capitalism is socially destructive, and thereafter the debate has always been about how much impingement on business is acceptable without destroying the economic prospects of the community. The modern problem is that the ownership class has an oversized influence on politics because of the role of money in modern campaigning. And the owners feel it is their moral right to maximize their financial reward for business success that ties into the strict father morality. Let's reflect a little bit on trust, in particular trust in government, to try to complete the picture of political beliefs in America. I think we need to include this factor of trust as being important. Similar to the economic issues, I think trust in government was a more salient factor in party identification from World War II to the 1990s. And you might recall how Ronald Reagan, he mined a widespread and chronic lack of trust in government with his declaration that the government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. Back then in the 80s and the 90s, Republicans clearly stood for less government, and they were very effective at labeling Democrats as proliferate spenders of your tax dollars. Remember those tax and spend Democrats? So a person may be somewhat supportive of something that we propose for government in principle, but they reject the idea because they think the government will just botch the assignment. So, for instance, people may like the idea of affordable and available healthcare, but think that having the government involved is absolutely the wrong way to approach things. This is partly because many people are convinced that if you are not beholden to having to compete for profit and loss in the market, then you will lack the motivation to be efficient and effective. So it's just fundamental. Government is not going to be efficient and not effective because there is no profit and loss motive in government. So now let's turn to the book, The Politics of Resentment. This is a deep dive into talking to rural communities that Catherine Kramer, a professor at the University of Washington, conducted in her in-depth study of political opinions of the residents in rural communities in Wisconsin from 2007 to 2012. And she sought out small groups in small towns that get together to talk about politics, and she just started picking their brains. And she sort of characterizes what she was learning as there being sort of a rural consciousness that describes a perspective that at its core is an identity rooted in place and class, and it's infused with this sense of distributive injustice, a sense that rural folks don't get their fair share. And so there's resentment that's directed at people outside of their area. They see their challenging circumstances as being the fault of government neglect and rewarding less deserving social groups, not just minorities. So the main sources of this rural resentment, there's a belief that rural areas are ignored by decision makers, including policymakers. There's a perception that rural areas do not get their fair share of resources. And they sense that rural folks have a fundamentally distinct values and lifestyles which are misunderstood and frankly disrespected by city folks. So this leads to a lot of resentment. So what are these rural values? Well, the value of hard work is a constant theme in this book. Also, how hard it is to survive economically in rural communities is another constant theme. People that they perceive as not working hard, i.e., as lazy, are considered to be undeserving. And they perceive that hard workers are the ones that are deserving of our respect and our support. So we're going to sort of view how some of these resentments get expressed by looking at some excerpts from conversations that she had. So here's an excerpt that expressed a resentment of free lunches. The author said, do you favor one of the presidential candidates? This was for the 2008 race. The response was, no, I don't like any of them. I'll take somebody that will let me keep some of my money rather than having to pay for everybody's free lunch. And what happened to this world where we all started out in a world where we had to work our ass off to get where we are? Nowadays, nobody wants to work their ass off, and they just want to have the money handed to them. And I mean, that's the scary part. So I think that, it's really off the cuff there. It's very informal, but it's expressing a deep resentment about free lunches. Here's another group conversation excerpt about government inefficiency. We sort of were picking it up in the middle here. One of the participants says, there's too many studies, and the other guy says, not enough work being done. Yeah, too much bureaucracy in the system. They do waste a lot of money on surveying roads. All those state employees, we look at them and we don't think they do much. Later in the conversation, the topic is hard work, and the author says, sometimes people say, well, survey research is, they ask about different occupations, and they ask people which one they think works the hardest. So tell me, what do you think if you compare a professor, a public school teacher, a waitress, a farmer, and a construction worker, which ones do you think work the hardest? And they piped up, well, the last three, which would be the waitress, the farmer, and the construction worker. And the other guy piped in, yeah, and for no benefits. So the author says, yeah, well, what about those first two? And she was going to talk about the professor and the school teacher. And one of the guys jumped in and he says, I think a school teacher, well, I know it can be hard, but they've got great benefits, tremendous benefits. And if you've been there for 15, 20 years, you're making 50 grand a year. There's nobody in this town other than them that's making 50 grand a year. The guys at the local mill, they make 20 grand. So you can see there's just a resentment about government workers and how they don't think they're efficient and they don't think they work hard. Here's another one about the incompetence of government. So the guy says, I went looking along and there was bass spawning and there was a little peg in the ground with a little red flag with a number on it. I seen these all over the lake. Well, they were there one day when I was fishing and they said, I said, what's with the red flags? And they said, oh, we're trying to determine if bass spawn in the same place every year. And I said, well, if you'd have asked anybody who lives up here, they'd have told you, yeah, and just save yourself a whole bunch of trouble. These guys, they don't want anything to do with you. They think they're smarter than you. Got that book learning. People go to college, they come out dumber than they went in. They got the books there, those books. It's not like real experience. So this is, communicating. They think the government is just incompetent. Here's a conversation about subsidized health care. The author says, do you think a lot of people who are retired in this community decide not to do health care at all? Do they just decide to take the risk? The guy says, some of them can't afford to do health care. It's not a matter of choosing, it's a matter of what you have to do. You pay some insurance company or do you buy groceries? Whatever. Well, if they would let us buy the insurance out of state, then that would be a whole lot cheaper. But they say, well, you can't buy insurance out of the state, got to be in the state. Well, that's just stupid. And the guy says, you look at the average income in the southern part of the state, and you look at the average income here, and you can tell me who is more prepared to buy their health insurance. And the guy pipes in, yeah, we're the second poorest county in the state. After Minimum, right? Isn't that right, Dave? He says, yeah, I think so. We're one of the poorest counties right now. So we're what, number two? And the state-run health program is, well, I'd like to say, well, that's going to take care of this, but that ain't going to work. There ain't a damn thing the state ever does that's cheap. So there's some themes that keep popping up in all these conversations. One is that the state government has too much power, that rural values and lifestyles are very central to their identity, that they don't get their fair share of resources from the state, that the state does not understand rural needs, and that rural people just want jobs. They don't want handouts. What are the four biggest complaints? One, the cost of healthcare. Two, the lack of jobs. Three, high taxes. And four, the cost of gas. You know, this was back 2007, 2008 when gas was really high. And in a rural setting, that really matters a lot too. So, there's a numerous takeaways from all of these conversations. I'm just going to sort of plow through them here. One is that rural versus urban is a huge factor in politics. They're just worlds with different worldviews, different worlds with different worldviews. Making a living is hard. Rural economies struggle. People have a hard time making ends meet. They resent the cities because they think they get a disproportionate amount of attention and money. Working hard is highly valued, and they're very disdainful of people that they don't think work hard, and they don't think city people, and especially government employees, work hard. So they resent the government employee salaries. They think they are protected too much from economic forces. And what they resent even more are the government employee benefits, because healthcare is a big worry for rural residents. Furthermore, they have a poor opinion of unions because most unions now are in the public sector, benefiting those lazy, inefficient, clueless government employees by vacuuming up more of their taxes. They think that they put more into the system via taxes than they get back out of it. They believe in small government because the government misuses the tax money. It's not efficient, and it spends it on urban communities, not rural communities. They would probably want the government to do more, but they lack the faith that the benefits would circle back to them. In other words, they're not blanket anti-government, but rather support is dependent on what their attitudes about a particular program's recipients are, whether they're deserving and whether everyone is getting their fair share. Although they vote Republican, they don't really think either party takes their needs seriously. Certainly the state does not understand the local situation, so they make clueless decisions, and the state meddles in issues that they don't need to be meddling in. The state creates lots of unnecessary and clueless regulations. And furthermore, they feel that their values and lifestyles are disrespected by the urban elites. They feel that the state universities undervalue their kids and they don't get a fair shot at college. Or conversely, they think that paying big money to go to college is a waste because experience is what counts. For them, jobs is the number one concern and priority, and everything flows from that. They claimed, this was 2008, not to like Hillary because she is an elitist, whereas Obama was a regular guy. So I have a couple other comments about the rural focus on hard work. Many rural residents interpret the hard life that they have had to live as evidence that anyone can do it, and that those who can't are just lazy. Folks ought to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps rather than advocate for an increased safety net. Pundits conclude that these people are voting against their interests, opposing the very kind of government programs that might help them out. But those kinds of claims neglect that a safety net may not translate as help to everyone. In rural areas, there's a great deal of pride in the idea that help is about letting people work enough so they can make it on their own. Help for many is about providing jobs, not welfare. I have one last quote from that book. This person said, the people who vote are not informed. The only source we trust is Fox News. And the author was able to trace back many of her interviewees' claims back to Fox News, such as the assertion that Obama was a hypocrite because he urged Americans to conserve energy while at the same time he was keeping the Oval Office very warm. So, particularly for liberals, this will seem a little bit hilarious. So, I want to put in a couple of my own 2 cents. This is, I call it the world according to Ken. And I have this theory about the fundamental worldviews, and it's because of this mystery about why some people think that life is hard, but apparently think that life is fair, but other people think that life is hard and sometimes unfair. And this ties back to where the conservative strict father morality is sort of based on the assumption that if you do everything right, if you become the right kind of person, you can make it, that you will survive this challenge. That must mean that the rules of the game are fair, that all it takes is the will, and that there aren't insurmountable impediments to you making it. That is a basic fundamental assumption about life that I don't think is shared by the other side. I think that they think that's too naive and Pollyannish, and that there are impediments, and so life isn't completely fair. So why would different people come to different conclusions about that? That's what I'm, pondering here in the world according to Ken. And so my theory is that it depends on how much influence you think you have over your world. And I think that people in a small town have a high degree of agency, whereas people in a big city, there's variable degrees of influence over your world. So in a small town, like if you're farming, nature is tough, but it doesn't play favorites. So it's a hard fight, but it's a fair fight. If you're in manufacturing, you're working for the big company, then everybody's in the same boat. They're playing by the same rules. It may be, you may feel an antagonism towards management and ownership, but as far as all the workers, it's considered to be a fair game, that you have a fighting chance there if you just develop the skills and have the right attitude. And then if it's a services profession, first of all, you can control your own reputation if you're the provider. But furthermore, other people care about their reputation, so you have some leverage. You can hold people to account, and that is a sense of agency, that this concern about reputation on both sides keeps people on the up and up, and so you can influence the game by playing it right. I think that comes from being in a small town. If you're in a big city, everybody is relatively anonymous, and so there's less personal accountability. There's less personal interdependence. And frankly, your reputation may not make much of a difference. You have worked all your life to have a reputation, but nobody knows about it, so it doesn't really pave the path for you. And furthermore, other people may not care much about what you think of them, because what you think of their reputation just isn't going to come back and bite them. You just lack the leverage that concern about reputation in both directions have. So all this adds up to not having a high degree of control over your circumstances. So I think that fellow citizens in the big city will not be surprised if they hear that you didn't get a fair chance. They understand that it might not just all be about working hard and being the right kind of person. So, small town residents assume that life is fundamentally fair, and big city residents understand that life is not always fair. Furthermore, small town people often conclude that the problem, if it seems unfair, the problem is that centralized government is putting their stupid finger on the scale unnecessarily and unfairly. So they don't think that the rules of the game are unfair if you just get the government to quit messing with the rules. Furthermore, I think that if you make it, if you're one of the haves, if you succeeded, whether it's in a big city or a small town, I think you kind of just assume that you just won a fair competition. I think it's natural to think that if you made it, that you deserved it, and that that meant that it was a fair competition. So there's sort of a natural tendency to dismiss the idea that, you made it, but other people can't make it. Like, I did it, so why can't you? It's a little bit of a burden of the haves to just break out of that self-satisfaction and realize, maybe I actually had some built-in advantages or some advantages that other people won't have. So that's Ken's theory about why there's this fundamental difference in the feeling about whether life is fair. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, this is referring to some insights from Nicholas Kristof. He and his wife Cheryl Wooden just published this book called Tightrope that looks at distressed communities in America, and in particular, he has some critical things to say about this persistent belief in the American dream, and I call it the psychology of the American dream. So let's review sort of the role of the American dream in the conservative worldview. On the conservative side, the American dream is aspirational. It is the source of hope and inspiration for people to strive to better themselves and their lives. And this is a fundamental reason why America is so successful. And they worry that, I think they subliminally worry that if you admit that there are societal forces that are beyond your control, that can deny you success even if you do everything right, that people will just give up instead of pushing through on adversity. So conservatives are supportive of the notion of equality of opportunity, but they're very resistant to goals that use equality of outcomes as the standard, because they think that pretty much the opportunities are there, and maybe there needs to be a little tweaking on that. But if you just sort of level out that opportunity thing, and then we're in business. I think that conservatives intuitively realize that if that age-old exhortation to pick yourself up by the bootstraps is based on false assumptions about the opportunities in modern society, then whoa, a lot of the conservative philosophy is just going to fall apart, because that is just a bedrock assumption for their other values. So Nicholas Kristof, he attributes much of our suffering to the myth that we live in a land of limitless opportunity, and the assumption that those who struggle have simply made bad choices and failed to muster personal responsibility. He says that he postulates that many suffering people weren't necessarily less responsible or less talented or less hardworking than their parents or their grandparents who had thrived in the post-war era. What had changed in the second half of the 20th century was diminished access to good jobs, reduced commitment to investment in human capital, and a hurricane of addictive drugs, some of which are peddled by the pharmaceutical industry, and the rise of a harsh social narrative that really vilified those that were left behind. And that's a narrative that the workers often internalized, and it led to depression and despair, and turning to drugs to just ease their anxieties. So he sees it as sort of a poison, and he has a recommendation for what a better social narrative would look like. It would acknowledge personal responsibility, but it would also acknowledge our collective social responsibility, especially to help children. It would be infused with empathy and a morality of grace that is less about pointing fingers and more about offering helping hands. And it would accept that a country cannot reach its potential when so many of its citizens are not achieving theirs. I think this is a very important insight that he has. And that's where I want to end part 2. There will be a third part, a separate recording, where we will talk about current politics and then talk about strategies for being more effective in communicating across our political divide. So I hope that I have continued to sustain your interest and that you will seek part 2. Thank you.